The sound of breaking glass shattered the already tense silence in the Lucky Dollar Saloon, and Helena Kane knew without looking that her past had just walked through the door in the form of Reverend Samuel Pritchard and his band of self-righteous townswomen who believed salvation could be measured by the height of a woman's collar and the depth of her shame. It was June of 1881 in Casa Grande, Arizona, and the desert heat had a way of making tempers flare faster than a struck match. Helena stood behind the bar, her emerald dress modest by saloon standards but scandalous by the Reverend's measure, and watched as the small group marched toward her with the kind of determination that usually preceded nothing good. She had been working at the Lucky Dollar for 3 years now, serving drinks and singing on Friday nights, nothing more despite what the gossips whispered behind their gloved hands. At 24 years old, she had learned that respectability was a luxury afforded only to those born into the right circumstances, and hers had been decidedly wrong. "Miss Kane," the Reverend began, his voice booming across the nearly empty afternoon saloon, "we have come to offer you one final chance at redemption. The church has secured a position for you as a laundress in Tucson. You would leave this evening on the stage." Helena set down the glass she had been polishing and met his gaze steadily. "And if I decline your generous offer, Reverend, then you condemn yourself to a life of sin and loneliness. No decent man would marry a saloon girl, Miss Kane. Surely you must know this." The words stung because they echoed the fears she carried in the quiet hours before dawn, but Helena had learned long ago not to show weakness to those who would use it against her. "I appreciate your concern for my immortal soul, Reverend, but I have a job here that pays my rent and keeps food on my table. That seems decent enough to me." Before Reverend Pritchard could launch into what was surely a prepared sermon, the saloon doors swung open again, and a man walked in who made Helena forget her rehearsed defenses. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and dark hair that curled slightly beneath his worn hat. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a striking blue-gray that seemed to take in everything at once, measuring and assessing with an intelligence that suggested he missed very little. "Reverend," the newcomer said, his voice carrying a slight drawl that marked him as a Texan, "seems like you are blocking the bar, and I have had a long ride from the Triple Y Ranch. I would be mighty grateful if you could conduct your business elsewhere." Reverend Pritchard turned, clearly ready to rebuke this interruption, but something in the cowboy's steady gaze made him reconsider. "We were just leaving, but mark my words, young man, association with this establishment and its employees will surely lead you down a dark path." The cowboy removed his hat, and Helena noticed the calluses on his hands, the kind earned through honest labor rather than cards or guns. "I reckon I will take my chances, Reverend. The Lord, I know, is more concerned with what is in a person's heart than where they earn their wages." The church delegation departed in a rustle of dark skirts and disapproving murmurs, and Helena found herself alone with the stranger who had just defended her without even knowing her name. She poured him a whiskey without being asked, needing something to do with her hands. "That was foolish," she said, sliding the glass across the bar. "The Reverend has influence in this town. Then it is a good thing I do not live in town." He took a sip and nodded appreciatively. "I am Yates Young. I manage the Triple Y about 10 miles northeast of here. Helena Kane. And before you ask, yes, I work in a saloon, and no, I do not need saving." Something that might have been amusement flickered across his face. "I was not planning to ask either of those things. I was going to ask if you knew where I might find a decent meal that does not involve beans and hardtack." Despite herself, Helena smiled. "The boarding house 2 streets over serves a good stew on Wednesdays. Today being Wednesday, you are in luck. Would you care to join me? I find eating alone gets tedious after a while." Helena's first instinct was to refuse. She knew how it looked, a saloon girl accepting an invitation from a stranger. But there was something in Yates Young's direct gaze that suggested the invitation was exactly what it seemed to be, nothing more and nothing less. "I finish my shift in an hour. The owner, Mr. Donnelly, does not like us leaving early. I can wait. Mind if I sit here and enjoy the quiet? It has been a hectic few weeks at the ranch." So Helena continued her work, polishing glasses and restocking bottles, acutely aware of Yates's presence at the bar. He did not try to make conversation or stare at her the way most men did. Instead, he seemed content to sit in comfortable silence, occasionally sipping his drink and watching the dust motes dance in the afternoon sunlight that filtered through the grimy windows. Patrick Donnelly emerged from the back room, his shrewd eyes taking in the solitary customer. "Helena, you can head out if you want. Maggie can handle things until the evening crowd arrives." This was unusual enough that Helena glanced at her employer with suspicion, but Donnelly just shrugged. "Business is slow. No sense paying you to stand around." 20 minutes later, Helena found herself walking down the dusty street beside Yates Young, feeling oddly self-conscious about her appearance. The boarding house was run by Mrs. Chen, a Chinese woman whose husband had worked on the railroad before dying in an accident 5 years prior. She served the best food in Casa Grande, but her establishment was frequented by railroad workers, ranch hands, and other working people, rather than the more respectable citizens who preferred the hotel dining room. Mrs. Chen greeted them with a warm smile and showed them to a table near the window. The stew was thick with vegetables and beef, served with fresh bread that was still warm from the oven. Helena could not remember the last time someone had bought her a meal without expecting something in return, and the novelty of it made her cautious. "You said you manage the Triple Y?" she asked, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. Yates nodded, sopping up stew with a piece of bread. "My uncle owns the spread. He is getting on in years and his arthritis makes it hard for him to ride anymore. I came out from Texas 2 years ago to help run things." "You must miss Texas." "Sometimes, but Arizona has its own beauty once you learn to see past all the dust and heat." He paused, his eyes meeting hers across the table. "What brought you to Casa Grande?" It was the question Helena had been dreading, the one that inevitably led to judgment and assumptions. "I came west with my father when I was 19. He heard there was opportunity out here, land for the taking. He died of fever 3 months after we arrived, and I found myself alone with no money and no prospects. Mr. Donnelly offered me a job and I took it. That must have been difficult. Difficult does not begin to cover it." Helena set down her spoon, her appetite fading with the memories. "But I survived, and that counts for something. It counts for a great deal." Yates's voice was matter-of-fact, without pity or condescension. "Survival takes strength, especially out here." They finished their meal talking about inconsequential things. The weather, the upcoming 4th of July celebration, the new railroad spur that was supposed to come through Casa Grande by the end of the year. When Yates walked her back to the small room she rented above the general store, he tipped his hat and said, "I enjoyed the company, Miss Kane. I come into town most Wednesdays for supplies. Perhaps we could do this again." Helena knew she should say no. She knew that being seen with a man, even in the innocuous setting of Mrs. Chen's boarding house, would only fuel the gossip that already swirled around her like desert wind. But there was something steady about Yates Young, something that made her want to say yes despite all her better judgment. "Perhaps," she said, and left it at that. Over the following weeks, Wednesday became the day Helena looked forward to with an anticipation she had not felt in years. Yates proved to be a man of his word, appearing at the Lucky Dollar each week after completing his errands, waiting patiently until she finished her shift, and then walking with her to Mrs. Chen's for a meal. They talked about everything and nothing, his life on the ranch, her dreams of someday having her own dress shop, the books they had read and the places they hoped to see. But as their friendship deepened, so did the town's disapproval. Helena began noticing the way conversations stopped when she walked past, the pointed stares from the women who shopped at the general store below her room. One evening in late July, as she was preparing to leave the saloon, Margaret Hartley, the mayor's wife, cornered her near the door. "Miss Kane, I feel it is my duty to warn you that your continued association with Mr. Young is causing quite a scandal. The poor man clearly does not understand the sort of woman you are, and I would hate to see him taken advantage of." Helena felt her cheeks burn with anger and humiliation. "Mrs. Hartley, I have done nothing improper. We share meals, nothing more. A saloon girl and a respectable ranch manager. My dear, the very nature of your employment makes any association improper. If you had any decency, you would leave the poor man alone before you ruin his reputation along with your own." That night, when Yates arrived, Helena told him they could not continue meeting. She stood in the dusty street outside the saloon, the evening heat still radiating from the adobe buildings, and forced herself to say the words she knew would hurt them both. "People are talking, Yates. Mrs. Hartley made it very clear that my presence in your life is causing problems. I will not be responsible for damaging your standing in the community." Yates listened in silence, his face unreadable in the gathering twilight. When she finished, he said simply, "Walk with me. Did you not hear what I just said? I heard you. Now walk with me." Against her better judgment, Helena followed him away from the main street, down past the livery stable and the blacksmith shop, to where the town gave way to open desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed impossible, too beautiful for this harsh land. They walked in silence until the sounds of Casa Grande faded behind them, replaced by the whisper of wind through creosote bushes and the distant call of a coyote. Finally, Yates stopped and turned to face her. "Helena, you know why I manage my uncle's ranch instead of starting my own?" The question surprised her. "No. Because 5 years ago I killed a man in Texas. He was cheating at cards, got caught, and went for his gun. I was faster. It was self-defense, clear as day, but his family had money and influence. They made sure everyone knew my name, made sure no bank would give me credit, no land office would sell to me. I came to Arizona because I needed a fresh start, same as you." Helena stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with the steady, quiet man she had come to know. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because I want you to understand that I know what it is like to be judged for your past, to have people look at you and see only one moment, one choice, one circumstance instead of the whole person you are. When Mrs. Hartley and the Reverend and all the other self-righteous folks in this town look at you, they see a saloon girl. They do not see the woman who sends half her wages back to Missouri to help support her cousin's children. They do not see the woman who sat up all night with old Tom when he was dying last winter, even though he had nothing to pay you with. They do not see the woman who can quote Shakespeare and discuss philosophy and dream of something better. How do you know about my cousin?" Helena's voice came out as barely a whisper. "Mrs. Chen told me. She is fond of you, in case you had not noticed. She also told me about old Tom and about how you have been teaching the Mexican children their letters on Sunday afternoons when everyone else is at church." Helena felt tears prick her eyes, a combination of embarrassment and something deeper, something that felt dangerously close to hope. None of that matters to people like Mrs. Hartley. I am what I am, and no amount of good deeds will change that. Then people like Mrs. Hartley can go to hell. The vehemence in Yates's voice startled her. Helena, I do not care what you do for a living. I do not care what the gossips say. I care about who you are, the woman I have spent every Wednesday getting to know, the woman who makes me laugh and challenges my thinking and makes me want to be better than I am. If you want to stop seeing me because you do not enjoy my company, I will respect that. But if you are pushing me away because you think I deserve someone more respectable, then you are making decisions for me that are not yours to make. Yates. She did not know what to say, how to respond to this declaration that seemed to overturn everything she thought she knew about her place in the world. I am not a fancy man with pretty words, Helena. I am just a cowboy who has spent most of his adult life working with horses and cattle. But I know what I want, and I want you. Not despite your past, not in spite of where you work, but including all of it because it is part of what made you into the woman standing in front of me right now. The tears she had been holding back spilled over, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. You do not know what you are saying. You do not know what it would mean, the way people would treat you, the doors that would close. I have had doors closed to me before. I survived. But Helena, if you walk away now, if you let their judgment become your decision, then they win. They get to define who you are and what you deserve, and I think you are stronger than that. In the fading light, with the desert stretching endlessly around them and the first stars beginning to appear overhead, Helena made a choice. She stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and when Yates wrapped his arms around her, it felt like coming home to a place she had never been before. I am frightened, she whispered against his chest. So am I, but I would rather be frightened with you than safe without you. They stood there as the darkness gathered, two people carrying their pasts like scars, choosing to believe that maybe, just maybe, they deserved a future together. The next Wednesday, when Yates came to town, he did not wait outside the saloon. He walked in, took a seat at the bar, and when Helena's shift ended, he offered her his arm in full view of everyone present. The statement was clear. He was courting her, and he did not care who knew it. The reaction was swift and predictable. Reverend Pritchard preached a sermon about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of choosing a godly spouse. Mrs. Hartley organized a petition asking the town council to revoke the Lucky Dollar's license. Several of the ranch owners who did business with the Triple Y made it known that they disapproved of Yates's choice of companion. But something unexpected happened as well. Mrs. Chen invited Helena and Yates to dinner at her private table, an honor she reserved for special occasions. Marcus Webb, the blacksmith whose daughter Helena had been teaching to read, publicly defended her character at a town meeting. Even Patrick Donnelly, who had always maintained a strictly professional relationship with his employees, told the Reverend that Helena Kane was worth 10 of his congregation, and he would be honored to have her work at his establishment for as long as she wanted. The support did not come from the expected quarters. It came from the working people, the ones who understood that survival sometimes meant making hard choices, that circumstances did not define character, and that grace should be extended to those who stumbled rather than judgment. One evening in August, as Helena and Yates sat outside Mrs. Chen's enjoying the slight cooling that came with sunset, he said, "My uncle wants to meet you." Helena felt her stomach drop. "Yates, I do not think that is a good idea. Your uncle's opinion matters, his ranch, his business relationships. His ranch that he has already deeded over to me. As of last week, I am the owner of the Triple Y, lock, stock, and barrel. Uncle Josiah is keeping a small house on the property and a percentage of the profits, but the decisions are mine now. Why did you not tell me? Because I wanted you to know that when I asked you to meet him, it was not about getting his permission or approval. It was about introducing him to the woman I intend to marry if she will have me. The world seemed to tilt slightly on its axis. Mary. Yates reached across the table and took her hand, his calloused fingers warm against her skin. I know it is fast. I know there are 100 practical reasons why we should wait. But Helena, I am 32 years old, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I wake up thinking about you. I go to sleep remembering something you said that made me laugh. When I am fixing fences or breaking horses or dealing with stubborn cattle, I find myself imagining what it would be like to come home to you at the end of the day. So yes, I am asking you to marry me, and I am asking knowing full well what the gossips will say and not caring one bit. Helena looked at their joined hands, thinking about all the reasons she should say no. She thought about the scandal it would cause, the way people would whisper that he had been trapped by a saloon girl, the assumption that she must be pregnant or using some other feminine wile to ensnare him. She thought about the loneliness of the ranch, so different from the town where she had built a life, however precarious. She thought about all of it, and then she thought about Wednesday afternoons, about conversations that stretched for hours, about the way Yates looked at her as though she was something precious and rare. Yes, she said, and watched his face transform with joy. They were married 3 weeks later in a simple ceremony at Mrs. Chen's boarding house, with Marcus Webb and his family in attendance, along with Patrick Donnelly. Several of the Lucky Dollar's regular customers who had always treated Helena with respect, and a handful of ranch hands from the Triple Y. Reverend Pritchard refused to perform the ceremony, so they found a retired judge who was willing to do the honors. Helena wore a blue dress that Mrs. Chen had helped her sew, simple but elegant, and Yates wore his best suit, which he admitted he had not put on since his mother's funeral 5 years prior. Uncle Josiah proved to be a weathered man in his late 60s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. My nephew tells me you are a reader, Mrs. Young. I have a whole shelf of books gathering dust in my house that I would be pleased to see put to good use. I would enjoy that very much, Mr. Young. None of that formal nonsense. I am Uncle Josiah to you now, same as I am to Yates. Welcome to the family such as it is. The ranch house was larger than Helena expected. A sprawling adobe structure with a wide porch that caught the evening breeze and thick walls that kept the worst of the heat at bay. There were 4 bedrooms, a large kitchen with a cast iron stove, a parlor with the promised bookshelf, and windows that looked out over seemingly endless desert punctuated by distant mountains. It needs a woman's touch, Yates said as he showed her through the rooms. My uncle lived here alone for years after my aunt passed, and I am afraid neither of us is much for decorating. But Helena could see past the dust and the sparse furnishings to what the place could become. She imagined curtains on the windows, rugs on the floors, her books on those shelves mingling with Uncle Josiah's collection. She imagined a life here, not just surviving but actually living, and the possibility of it took her breath away. That first night, after Uncle Josiah had retired to his small house on the other side of the property, Helena and Yates sat on the porch and watched the stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky. The desert night was full of sounds, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the distant howl of coyotes singing to the rising moon. "Are you happy?" Yates asked, his arm around her shoulders. Helena leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I am terrified and exhilarated and happy and afraid all at once. Is that normal? If it is not, then we are both abnormal together." She laughed, and the sound seemed to float out into the darkness, a small declaration of joy in the face of all the uncertainty. "I never thought this could happen for me. I had resigned myself to a certain kind of life, one where I worked and saved and maybe someday had enough put away to start my dress shop. I never let myself imagine more than that. What do you imagine now?" It was a dangerous question because it invited hope, and hope was something Helena had learned to ration carefully. But sitting there in the darkness with Yates's arm around her and the whole desert spreading out before them, she let herself answer honestly. "I imagine making this house a home. I imagine learning about ranching and maybe keeping chickens and a garden. I imagine Sunday afternoons reading in the parlor and evenings like this where we can just sit and talk. I imagine children, eventually, if we are blessed. But mostly I imagine waking up every morning and not being afraid, not waiting for the other shoe to drop, not measuring every word and action against what people will think. I imagine being free." Yates turned her face toward him, and in the starlight she could see the emotion in his eyes. "Then that is what we will build together. Day by day, choice by choice, until freedom is not something you imagine but something you live." He kissed her then, gentle and reverent, and Helena felt something inside her that had been locked tight for years begin to open. This was what she had not let herself hope for, not just security or companionship, but love, real and deep and transformative. The following weeks were an adjustment as Helena learned the rhythms of ranch life. She woke before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the ranch hands, spent her mornings learning to manage the household accounts and supplies, and her afternoons exploring her new home. Yates taught her to ride, starting with the gentlest mare in the stable, and she discovered a surprising joy in the freedom of moving across the open land. Uncle Josiah became an unexpected friend, sharing his books and his stories of the early days in Arizona when the territory was even wilder than it was now. He had fought in the Mexican War, traveled to California during the gold rush, and eventually settled in Casa Grande when it was barely more than a dusty crossroads. His wife had died 10 years ago, and Helena sensed that he had been lonely in the years since, rattling around in the big house with only his memories for company. "I am glad Yates found you," he told her one afternoon as they sat in the parlor going over the supply lists. "He is a good man, but he has carried his past like a burden for too long. You have given him permission to let it go." "He has done the same for me," Helena said. "That is how the best marriages work, I think. Two people helping each other become more than they could be alone." But their peace was shattered on a scorching day in late September when a group of riders came to the ranch. Helena was in the garden, trying to coax vegetables from the stubborn soil, when she heard the thunder of hooves. She straightened, shading her eyes against the sun, and felt her heart sink as she recognized several of the men. Thaddeus Hartley, the mayor, sat astride a black gelding, flanked by Reverend Pritchard and 3 other town council members. Yates emerged from the barn, wiping his hands on his work pants, his expression unreadable. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "What brings you out to the Triple Y?" Mayor Hartley dismounted, his movements stiff with self-importance. "Mr. Young, we have come to discuss a serious matter. As you know, the town council is in the process of organizing the 4th annual Harvest Festival, and we must select a committee to oversee the event. I am afraid I do not see what this has to do with me or my ranch. In previous years, you have served on the festival committee. However, given your recent marriage, we feel it would be inappropriate for you to continue in that capacity. We cannot have someone of Mrs. Young's background involved in organizing a family event." Helena felt the words like a physical blow, But before she could respond, Yates's voice cut through the air like a whip crack. "Let me make sure I understand you correctly, Mayor. You rode 10 miles in this heat to tell me that my wife's previous employment disqualifies me from helping organize a dance and a pie contest." Reverend Pritchard cleared his throat. "Mr. Young, you must understand our position. There are standards of decency that must be maintained. Your wife worked in a saloon. She served liquor to men. The very nature of that employment suggests a moral flexibility that we cannot endorse." "The very nature of that employment," Yates said, his voice dangerously quiet, "suggests that she did what she needed to do to survive after her father died and left her alone in a hostile land with no resources and no support. The very nature of that employment suggests that she chose honest work over the alternatives, that she kept her dignity and her integrity in circumstances that would have broken lesser people. And the very nature of your visit today suggests that you gentlemen have too much time on your hands and not enough actual problems to solve." Mayor Hartley's face reddened. "Now see here, Young, there is no call for that kind of tone. We are simply trying to maintain the moral standards of our community. No, you are trying to punish my wife for having the audacity to survive difficult circumstances without your permission or approval. And you are using your positions of authority to do it, which makes it even more contemptible." Helena found her voice, stepping forward from the garden. "Mayor Hartley, I have never applied to be on any committee. I have never sought involvement in town affairs or pushed myself where I was not wanted. I have done nothing to you or anyone else that warrants this visit. Your very existence in respectable society is the offense, Mrs. Young. By marrying above your station, you have forced good people to make uncomfortable choices about whether to acknowledge you, whether to invite you to their homes, whether to do business with your husband." "Then let me make it easy for everyone," Helena said, her voice shaking with suppressed anger. "I will not attend your festival or any other town event. I will not shop at any establishment where my presence causes discomfort. I will stay on this ranch and live my life, and you can all rest easy knowing that the scandalous saloon girl is safely tucked away where she cannot contaminate your precious moral standards." "Helena, no," Yates started, but she shook her head. "What choice do I have, Yates? They have made it clear that I am not welcome. Fighting them will only make things harder for you, for the ranch, for Uncle Josiah. I will not be responsible for that." Mayor Hartley had the grace to look slightly uncomfortable. "Mrs. Young, we do not wish to be cruel. We are simply maintaining necessary boundaries." "You are being cruel," Uncle Josiah's voice rang out from the porch, startling everyone. The old man walked forward, leaning heavily on his cane, his face tight with anger. "You are a pack of hypocrites who would not know genuine decency if it bit you on your sanctimonious backsides. Thaddeus, I knew your father, and he would be ashamed of the small-minded bully you have become. Reverend, you preach about grace and forgiveness every Sunday, but apparently those concepts only apply to people who already have your approval. As for the rest of you, you should be embarrassed to call yourselves men. Mr. Young, your loyalty to your nephew is admirable, but—" Reverend Pritchard began. "My loyalty is not to my nephew. It is to justice and common sense, both of which are severely lacking in this conversation. Helena Kane, now Helena Young, is worth a dozen of your wives and daughters put together, and the only reason you cannot see that is because you are blinded by your own self-righteousness. Now get off my property before I forget my manners entirely and take a horsewhip to the lot of you." The delegation left, and Helena stood in the dust of their departure feeling hollowed out and exhausted. Yates tried to put his arm around her, but she pulled away, needing space to breathe, to think, to process the full weight of what had just happened. "I should never have married you," she said, the words tasting like ash. "I have ruined everything. Your reputation, your business relationships, your place in the community. All because I was selfish enough to believe I could have something better. Helena, look at me." Yates stepped in front of her, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "You have not ruined anything. Those men are small and scared and clinging to power by putting other people down. That is their failure, not yours. Do you honestly think I care about serving on some festival committee? Do you think I need the approval of men like Thaddeus Hartley to know my own worth or yours? But the business, the ranch, if they turn other people against you, then we will find new people to do business with. Helena, there are other towns, other ranchers, other buyers for our cattle. We are not dependent on Casa Grande for our survival. And even if we were, even if marrying you cost me everything, I would make the same choice again without hesitation." She wanted to believe him, but the fear was too deep, too much a part of her survival instincts. "You say that now, but what happens in a year when the bills come due and the other ranchers will not deal with you? What happens in 5 years when you resent me for all the doors that closed because of who I was? What I resent is living in a world where good people are judged by circumstances rather than character. What I resent is watching you dim your light because other people are threatened by your brightness. Helena, decency is not about the past. It is not about where you have been or what you have done to survive. It is about who you choose to be right now in this moment and in all the moments that follow. By that measure, you are the most decent person I know." Uncle Josiah's cane thumped against the porch boards. "The boy is right, though it pains me to admit it since his head is already plenty big. Helena, I have lived 70 years on this earth, and I have learned that there are 2 kinds of people. Those who rise by lifting others up, and those who stand tall by pushing others down. You are the first kind. They are the second. Do not let their smallness make you question your own worth." That night, Helena lay awake long after Yates had fallen asleep beside her, staring at the ceiling and wrestling with demons that whispered she did not deserve this life, this love, this chance at happiness. She had spent so many years believing that her past defined her future, that the choices made in desperation would follow her forever. That redemption was something that happened to other people, never to someone like her. But maybe, she thought as the first light of dawn began to creep through the window, maybe that was the lie she needed to stop believing. Maybe decency really was not about the past. Maybe it was about choosing, day after day, to show up as your best self, to treat others with kindness, to do the work that needed doing with integrity and grace. Maybe she had been decent all along, and the only person who had not realized it was herself. The next morning, Helena got up before dawn and baked bread, the simple rhythmic work soothing her restless thoughts. When Yates came in for breakfast, she set a plate in front of him and said, "I want to host a dinner party." He looked up, surprised. "A dinner party? For everyone who has been kind to us. Mrs. Chen, Marcus Webb and his family, Patrick Donnelly, the ranch hands who stood up for us. I want to thank them properly, show them that their support meant something. And I want to stop hiding, stop acting like I have something to be ashamed of. I may not be welcome in certain circles, but I can create my own circle, one built on actual decency rather than appearances." A slow smile spread across Yates's face. "I think that is a fine idea, Mrs. Young, a very fine idea indeed." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing. Helena threw herself into the project with an energy born of determination and newfound purpose. She cleaned the house from top to bottom, made curtains for the windows, and planned a menu that would showcase her cooking skills. Yates and the ranch hands built tables and benches in the yard where they could accommodate the 20 guests they had invited. The dinner party took place on a cool October evening, the oppressive summer heat finally broken by the changing season. Lanterns hung from the porch beams, casting warm light over the gathering. Mrs. Chen arrived early to help with the final preparations, bringing her famous dumplings and a beautiful embroidered tablecloth as a house-warming gift. Marcus Webb came with his wife and 4 children, the youngest of whom immediately attached herself to Uncle Josiah and demanded stories. Patrick Donnelly brought his fiddle and a bottle of good whiskey that he presented to Yates with a solemn handshake. As the sun set and the stars emerged, Helena looked around at the faces illuminated by lantern light, at the people laughing and talking and enjoying the food she had prepared, and felt something shift inside her. This was community, real and genuine, built not on social standing or approval but on mutual respect and shared humanity. These people knew her story, knew where she had worked and what she had survived, and they had chosen to stand beside her anyway. After dinner, Patrick Donnelly tuned his fiddle and began to play, soft melodies that drifted out into the desert night. Several couples got up to dance, and Yates extended his hand to Helena with a slight bow. "May I have this dance, Mrs. Young?" She took his hand, letting him lead her into the simple steps of a waltz. She was not a practiced dancer, but Yates was patient, guiding her through the movements until she relaxed into the rhythm. As they turned beneath the stars, Helena caught Uncle Josiah's eye across the yard. The old man raised his glass to her in a silent toast, and she felt tears prick her eyes. "What are you thinking?" Yates asked, his breath warm against her ear. "I am thinking that I am happy. Truly, deeply happy in a way I was not sure I would ever feel. And I am thinking how grateful I am that you walked into the lucky dollar that day and decided I was worth the trouble. You were never trouble, Helena. You were always worth it." As fall turned to winter and winter to spring, life on the Triple Y settled into a comfortable rhythm. Helena discovered she had a talent for managing the ranch books, her careful attention to detail proving invaluable as they navigated the ups and downs of the cattle business. She also started teaching again, this time holding lessons twice a week in the ranch house for the children of their workers and neighbors. Word spread, and soon she had a dozen students of various ages, learning reading, writing, and arithmetic around her kitchen table. Yates proved to be as steady and reliable as Helena had hoped, a partner in every sense of the word. He consulted her on ranch decisions, valued her opinions, and never once made her feel lesser for her past. When cattle prices dropped and money grew tight, they worked together to find solutions. When a winter storm killed a dozen head and threatened their solvency, Helena was the one who suggested diversifying their income by breeding horses, an idea that proved remarkably profitable. The town continued to hold them at arm's length, but Helena found she minded less and less as time went on. They had their own community, one that sprawled beyond the artificial boundaries of respectability to include anyone willing to treat them with basic human kindness. Mrs. Chen became a close friend, visiting regularly and teaching Helena to cook Chinese dishes that delighted Uncle Josiah's adventurous palate. The Webb family became like extended relatives, their children running wild across the ranch on weekends while Marcus and his wife Sarah helped with various projects. It was Sarah Webb who first suspected that Helena was pregnant, noticing things even Helena herself had missed. "You have been looking green around the gills in the mornings," she said one day as they sat shelling peas on the porch. "And unless I am much mistaken, your waistline is expanding." Helena pressed a hand to her stomach, realization washing over her. She had been so busy with the ranch, and the teaching and the 100 daily tasks that demanded her attention that she had not stopped to notice the signs her body had been giving her. But now that Sarah mentioned it, the evidence was clear. That evening, she told Yates as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, their usual end-of-day ritual. His reaction was everything she could have hoped for, joy and wonder, and a tenderness that made her throat tight with emotion. "A baby," he said, placing his hand gently over hers on her stomach. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" she asked, needing to hear him say it. "Helena, I am beyond happy. I am blessed, terrified but blessed." Their daughter was born in early January of 1883, arriving during a cold snap that had Uncle Josiah muttering about the worst weather he had seen in 20 years. Mrs. Chen served as midwife, her capable hands and calm demeanor seeing Helena through the long hours of labor. When the baby finally emerged, wailing her displeasure at being thrust into the cold world, Helena wept with relief and exhaustion and overwhelming love. They named her Rose Josephine Young. Rose for Helena's mother and Josephine for Uncle Josiah, who wept unashamedly when they told him. She was a demanding baby, colicky and fussy, but when she looked at Helena with eyes that were already turning the same blue-gray as her father's, Helena felt her heart expand in ways she had not imagined possible. Motherhood proved to be both harder and more rewarding than Helena expected. The sleepless nights were grueling, but the first smile made it worthwhile. The constant demands were exhausting, but the sweet weight of her daughter in her arms was precious beyond measure. Yates was a devoted father, walking the floor with Rose when she fussed, changing diapers without complaint, and watching his daughter with an expression of wonder that never quite faded. Uncle Josiah became Rose's favorite person outside her parents, and the sight of the wizened old cowboy with the tiny baby cradled in his arms became a common one around the ranch. He told her stories, sang her songs in a cracked voice, and declared that she was the prettiest little thing he had ever seen. When Rose was 6 months old, Helena took her into Casa Grande for the first time, needing supplies from the general store. She had been bracing herself for judgment, for cold shoulders and pointed stares. What she got instead was surprising. Several women she did not know stopped to admire the baby, cooing over her dark curls and bright eyes. Mrs. Peterson, the postmaster's wife who had previously crossed the street to avoid Helena, paused to ask how old Rose was and to offer advice about teething. Even Mrs. Hartley, when Helena encountered her outside the mercantile, managed a stiff nod of acknowledgement. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. It seemed that motherhood had granted Helena a measure of respectability that marriage alone had not, as though producing a child proved she was a real woman after all, worthy of basic courtesy if not full acceptance. Helena found the irony bitter, but she was pragmatic enough to appreciate the small mercies. Still, the real support came from their chosen family. When Rose was a year old, they held a party at the ranch that drew nearly 50 people, workers and friends and neighbors who had become dear to them over the past 2 years. Uncle Josiah presented Rose with a hand-carved rocking horse that must have taken him months to make, and Helena saw Yates wipe discreetly at his eyes when the old man placed the gift in their daughter's chubby hands. Life continued its steady progression. Rose grew from baby to toddler, strong-willed and curious, into everything and afraid of nothing. Helena's teaching expanded to include afternoon classes for adults who wanted to improve their reading or learn basic arithmetic. The ranch prospered, their diversification into horse breeding proving prescient as demand for good working horses continued to grow. In the spring of Rose's 3rd year, Uncle Josiah took ill. What started as a simple cold progressed to pneumonia, and despite Mrs. Chen's best efforts and a doctor summoned from Tucson, he continued to weaken. Helena sat with him during the long nights, reading to him from his favorite books and talking about everything and nothing. "I am glad I got to meet you," he told her one evening, his voice thin and reedy. "I am glad Yates found someone worthy of him, and I am glad I got to see what you two built together. That little girl is my legacy as much as this ranch, and I could not ask for a better one." "You are not going anywhere," Helena said, even though they both knew it was not true. "My dear, I am 82 years old and I have lived a full life. I have seen things most people only read about, loved a good woman, built something lasting, and spent my final years surrounded by family. A man could not ask for more." He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep, and they buried him on a rise overlooking the ranch under a cottonwood tree he had planted 40 years ago. The funeral drew people from across the territory, old cowboys and former business partners and people whose lives he had touched over his long years in Arizona. As they stood at the graveside, Rose clutching Helena's hand and asking in her piping 3-year-old voice why everyone was so sad, Helena felt the weight of gratitude and loss tangled together. Uncle Josiah had been the first person in Casa Grande, besides Yates, to treat her with unconditional kindness, to see past her history to her humanity. His acceptance had mattered more than she had realized, and his loss left a hole that would not easily be filled. But life on a ranch does not pause for grief, and there were cattle to tend and horses to train, and 100 daily tasks that demanded attention. Helena threw herself into work, finding solace in routine and in the solid dependability of Yates beside her. They had discussions about whether to hire a foreman now that Uncle Josiah was gone, about expanding their breeding program, about when to send Rose to proper school versus continuing to teach her at home. In the midst of these practical considerations, Helena discovered she was pregnant again. The revelation came with mixed emotions, joy tempered by exhaustion at the thought of starting over with an infant. But Yates's delight was uncomplicated, and Rose's excitement at the prospect of a baby brother or sister was infectious. Their son was born in November of 1886, an easier birth than Rose had been. They named him Henry Josiah Young, and from the beginning he was a different child than his sister, placid where she was energetic, content where she was demanding. Rose adored him with the fierce devotion of a protective older sister, insisting on helping with everything and declaring him to be her baby as much as anyone else's. The years that followed were full in ways Helena could not have imagined in her lucky dollar days. The ranch continued to grow, their reputation for quality horses spreading throughout the territory. Helena's school became a fixture, with students traveling from surrounding ranches to attend her lessons. Yates served on various cattlemen's associations and trade groups, his opinions valued even if his wife was not always welcome at social functions. Casa Grande itself was changing, growing from a dusty outpost to a proper town with a new hotel, a bank, and talk of a railroad spur that would connect them more directly to the broader markets. The influx of new people brought fresh perspectives, and Helena found that younger residents were less concerned with her past than with what she could offer in the present. When Rose was 7 and Henry 4, the town council approached Yates about serving as mayor. He refused, but suggested they might consider Marcus Webb, whose blacksmith shop had become central to the town's growth and whose even temperament made him a natural leader. To Helena's surprise and Marcus's shock, the council agreed, and Casa Grande got its first mayor who had not been born to privilege. Marcus's election marked a shift in the town's culture, a slow opening of minds and hearts that Helena had never expected to see. Under his leadership, the town established a proper school and hired a young teacher from back east who was more concerned with her students' progress than their parents' social standing. Helena was invited to serve on the school board, an invitation she accepted with some trepidation but growing confidence. The vindication she felt at her appointment was sweet, but also bittersweet. She could not help but remember those early days, the judgment and condemnation, the way people had crossed the street to avoid her. Part of her wanted to gloat, to throw her acceptance back in the faces of those who had rejected her. But mostly she felt tired of fighting, ready to let the past be past and focus on building something better. On her 30th birthday, Yates surprised her by presenting her with the deed to a small building on Main Street. "For your dress shop," he said, "if you still want it." Helena stared at the paper in her hands, at the official legal language that proclaimed her the owner of property in Casa Grande, and felt tears well up. "Yates, this must have cost a fortune. The ranch needs. The ranch is doing fine, better than fine. And you have been talking about this dream since before I married you. It is time to make it real." She opened Helena's fine dressmaking in the spring of 1889, 8 years after she had first arrived in Casa Grande as the new Mrs. Yates Young. The shop was small but beautifully appointed, with bolts of fabric lining the walls and a sewing machine that had cost as much as 3 good horses. Helena employed 2 seamstresses, both women who had worked in less reputable establishments and needed a fresh start, and together they created garments that were talked about throughout the territory. The irony of respectable women lining up to be fitted by the former saloon girl was not lost on Helena. Mrs. Hartley herself came in one day, requesting a dress for her daughter's wedding, and the 2 women engaged in polite small talk that carefully avoided mentioning their past interactions. Helena took her measurements and promised the finest work, and when Mrs. Hartley picked up the finished garment, she admitted grudgingly that it was the most beautiful dress she had ever owned. Life settled into a new rhythm, busier than before but deeply satisfying. Helena split her time between the ranch, the shop, and her teaching, somehow managing to balance it all while raising 2 active children. Yates remained her rock, steady and supportive, never complaining about the early mornings or late nights, always ready with an encouraging word or a helping hand. Rose grew into a bright, fierce girl who could ride as well as any of the ranch hands, and who announced at age 10 that she was going to be a veterinarian when she grew up. Never mind that there were no female veterinarians, and everyone said it was impossible. Henry was quieter but no less determined, fascinated by books and mathematics, spending hours working through the problems Helena set for him, and always hungry for more knowledge. On a warm evening in June of 1892, as Helena and Yates sat on their porch watching Rose teach Henry to rope a fence post, Yates said, "Do you ever regret it? Marrying me, leaving the certainty of your life in town, taking on all of this?" Helena looked at him, surprised. "Why would you ask that?" "Because I watch you juggling everything, the ranch and the shop and the children and the teaching, and I wonder if it is too much, if you would have been happier with a simpler life." She took his hand, threading her fingers through his. "Yates, do you remember that night in the desert when you asked me what I imagined for my future?" "I remember. I said I imagined freedom, not a life without challenges or work, but freedom from fear, from judgment, from having to measure every word and action against what other people think. That is what you gave me. Not a simple life, but a free one. A life where I get to choose who I am rather than having it chosen for me. How could I regret that?" He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Helena Young. I loved you when you were serving drinks in a saloon, and I love you now as a successful businesswoman and mother and teacher. But mostly I love you for being you, constant and true no matter what role you are playing. I love you too, more than I ever thought possible. You saw me when I was invisible to everyone else. You believed in me when I could not believe in myself. You taught me that decency is not about where you have been, but about where you are going and who you choose to be along the way. They sat in comfortable silence as the desert twilight deepened, watching their children play and listening to the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night. Cattle lowed in the distance, horses whickered in the corral, and somewhere a coyote sang its lonely song to the rising moon. 20 more years would pass in what felt like both an eternity and an instant. Rose did indeed become a veterinarian, studying at a progressive college back east, and then returning to Casa Grande to set up a practice that served the entire territory. She married a young lawyer from Tucson, a quiet man who supported her ambitions and never tried to dim her bright spirit. They gave Helena and Yates 4 grandchildren who spent their summers running wild on the ranch, just as Rose had done. Henry went to university to study engineering and ended up working for the railroad, designing bridges and tunnels that helped connect the sprawling West. He married a schoolteacher, a woman as bookish and gentle as he was, and they settled in Flagstaff, where Helena and Yates visited several times a year. Their 3 children were quieter than Rose's brood, but no less loved. Helena's dress shop thrived, eventually expanding to include a second location in Tucson. She trained dozens of young women in the craft of dressmaking, always preferring to hire those who had faced hardship or judgment, who understood the value of a second chance. Her teaching continued well into her 60s, children and grandchildren of her first students sitting at the same kitchen table where their parents had learned their letters. The ranch remained the center of their lives, the place they always returned to no matter how far they traveled. Yates slowed down as the years accumulated, his hair going gray and then white, his movements becoming more careful. But his eyes still lit up when he looked at Helena, and his hand still reached for hers automatically whenever they sat together. On their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by children and grandchildren and friends who had become family, Yates stood to make a toast. His voice was not as strong as it had once been, but it carried clearly across the crowded yard. 30 years ago, I walked into a saloon in Casa Grande and met a woman who changed my life. The town said no decent man would marry a saloon girl, but I knew something they did not. Decency is not about the past, not about circumstances or choices made in desperation. Decency is about character, about integrity, about showing up every day and doing your best even when the world is against you. By that measure, Helena Young is the most decent person I have ever known. She has been my partner, my best friend, my moral compass, and my greatest adventure. Here is to 30 more years if the good Lord is willing. Everyone raised their glasses, and Helena felt tears streaming down her face, happy tears for all they had built, for all they had survived, for the love that had sustained them through every challenge. She stood and wrapped her arms around her husband, this man who had seen her when she was invisible, who had believed in her when she could not believe in herself, who had shown her that redemption was not something granted by others, but something you claimed for yourself, one choice at a time. They did not get 30 more years. Yates died peacefully in his sleep 2 years later at the age of 83. He was buried beside Uncle Josiah on the rise overlooking the ranch, under the same cottonwood tree. Helena stood at his graveside surrounded by their family, telling stories about the man who had loved her without condition, who had built a life with her that defied every expectation and judgment. She lived another 12 years, continuing to run the ranch with help from her children and grandchildren, continuing to teach and sew and build the community that had eventually embraced her. When she died at 76, the funeral drew people from across Arizona, former students and employees and friends, all coming to pay respects to a woman who had transformed herself from saloon girl to pillar of the community, not by denying her past, but by refusing to let it define her. They buried her beside Yates, and on her headstone rose insisted they include the words that had defined her mother's life. Decency is not about the past. Below that, Helena's dates and a simple epitaph. She chose her own story. The ranch passed to Rose, who ran it in partnership with her brother, maintaining the traditions their parents had established while adapting to the changing times. The dress shop continued for another generation before finally closing, but the building remained in the family, eventually becoming a museum dedicated to Arizona women's history. Helena's story was told there, honestly and completely, from her arrival as a desperate young woman to her transformation into a respected businesswoman and educator. Her legacy lived on in the dozens of women she had trained and employed, in the hundreds of students she had taught, in the children and grandchildren who carried her values forward into new generations. But perhaps her greatest legacy was the simple truth she had lived, that people are more than their worst moments, more than their difficult circumstances, more than the judgments others place upon them. That decency, real decency, is measured not by where you have been, but by who you choose to be, day after day, choice after choice, until choosing kindness and integrity becomes as natural as breathing. And in the end, that was the story Helena Kane Young wanted told. Not a tale of scandal and redemption, but a love story between two people who saw each other clearly, who chose each other fully, and who built something lasting on the foundation of mutual respect and unconditional acceptance. A cowboy who looked past the saloon girl to see the woman beneath, and a woman who learned to see herself through his eyes and finally believe she was worthy of the love he offered. It was a story played out against the harsh beauty of the Arizona desert, in a time when the West was wild and life was hard, and surviving took strength most people never had to discover. But it was also a timeless story, one that transcends era and location, about the transformative power of love that asks nothing except that you show up as yourself, fully and honestly, and trust that you are enough exactly as you are. The children and grandchildren would tell this story for generations, embellishing some parts and glossing over others, but always returning to the central truth. Their grandmother had been a saloon girl who married a cowboy, and together they had proved that decency was not about the past, but about the courage to keep choosing love and kindness and integrity no matter what the world said you deserved. It was a lesson worth remembering, worth passing down, worth living, then and always.